Hey Bud Dragons, welcome back to my channel. So the question of the day is, should you read the Warlord Chronicles by Cornwell? Let's go. Thank you to my patrons. I really appreciate all you do to support the channel. So recently I finished the final book in the Warlord Chronicles by Cornwell called Excalibur. And I've got to say, guys, I was pretty impressed with this series. It started off a little rocky for me, and we'll talk about that a little while later. But overall, I really enjoyed this series. And I think it's a very worthwhile read. So we'll talk about that. Before we do, please make sure that if you are getting value out of this video, I'd love it if you would like the video and subscribe to my channel if you enjoy my content. Support me on Patreon if you'd like to. That's always cool. And without further ado, let's get right to my review. So what is this series? Oh, well, hello, Ari. It is a historical fiction retelling of the Arthurian myths, told from the first-person perspective of Derval Cadern. Derval is a Saxon who is now a Christian monk in his waning years, and at one time he fought under the banner of Lord Arthur of Britain against the Saxons and the Irish warlords and different groups that were fighting to take control of Britain. And he has been commissioned by the current queen to tell the story of Arthur, but is doing so in secret because to tell the story of Arthur would involve putting a great deal of positive light on pagan practices. And so the Christian priest that he works for now would not look favorably upon that. And so he's writing it in Saxon, which the monk cannot read. And he is recounting the tales of his adventures with Arthur to the queen. It's a very unique way of telling the story. Not that writing in the first person is unique at all, but the particular way that Bernard Cornwell writes this is very unique. One of the strong points of this series is the character work. I'm not going to talk about all the characters, but I am going to talk about the most significant characters. The first of which, of course, being Derval. At the beginning of this story, Derval is a Saxon foundling who has been welcomed into the kingdom of the current reigning monarch, Uther Pendragon. And of course, as I said, Derval is the one recounting this story and telling of his exploits as time goes by. And there is also Lancelot, who is known kingdom-wide for his tales of valor in battle, his shiny armor, the beauty of his face, the stature that he carries himself with, when in reality he is a pompous ass who has not really seen the heat of battle at all and usually sends others to fight his battles for him. So yes, in this story, Lancelot is not well loved by most people, except people who don't know any better. And of course, no Arthurian legend would be complete without Arthur Pendragon. He is the bastard-born son of Uther in this tale, and because of being bastard-born, he is not able to lay any claim to the throne of Britain. There is also the Irish maiden Cynwen, who at one point in the story is initially betrothed to Arthur. Then things transpire that she is no longer betrothed to Arthur. She becomes betrothed to Lancelot at one point, and then she rejects him in favor of Derval, and so she becomes the consort of Derval and at one point in the story his wife. And of course we also have the wizard Merlin except in this story he is a druid. The druids were very prominent at this time in Great Britain, and so he is a druid magician who shows up when it suits his purpose, and at other points he's just not around very much, but he will show up at the darndest times. There is also Morgan, who is the sister of Arthur. She is at one point the concubine of Merlin, but at some point he rejects her in favor of Nimue, or Nimue. The narrator of the audiobook says Nimue. I thought it was Nimue. I might be wrong, but in any case, we'll talk about her really briefly because she is a druid in training under Merlin and has also become his lover. You may know Nimue from the Arthurian tales, being the Lady of the Lake who is the guardian of Excalibur. But in this story, she is much different. We talked briefly about Uther, who is still the reigning king at the time the story begins, and he has slept with his daughter to father another highborn child who he hopes will grow up to be the king to take over his kingdom, and that child is Merlin. So he is the quote-unquote full-blooded son of Uther and is named the heir apparent to the Kingdom of Britain. And then there are some other well-known names from the Arthur legends, like Sir Galahad and Sir Gawain. So though they pop up in the story from time to time, but they're very minor side characters, more cameos than anything. So now let's talk about the Arthurian myths versus the reality that is presented in these books. As Derville is relaying this story, he is very careful to let the readers know that at some point in the story, there are things that are going to be changed to suit a more fanciful, more fairy tale-esque retelling of the reality that he is presenting. For instance, Excalibur is not the actual name of the blade. I forget the name, to be honest with you, because it's a very odd Welsh pronunciation, doesn't roll off the tongue. But in any case, it has come to be known in popular legend as Excalibur, and he mentions that. And Camelot is the same way. It does exist, but under a totally different name, and the idea of the Knights of the Round Table is there, but it is more of an ideal that Arthur was hoping for, a united Britain with all the lords of the different minor kingdoms working together to create this powerful kingdom of a united Britain. So it was more of an ideal, more of a dream of Arthur's that may or may not come to reality. You'll just have to read the book to find out for yourself. A lot of people associate the King Arthur legend with the Holy Grail, and so there is a quote-unquote Grail quest in the story, but in this case it's a large cauldron called the Cauldron of Clifno-Ethan. I may be pronouncing that wrong, so just bear with me. But it is a cauldron for stirring up magical potions and working feats of magic. And speaking of magic, there is magic in this book, but it is not magic like we would read in a typical fantasy novel. It is more grounded in reality. It is more doubtable. It is druid magic, so again, Merlin is not an all-powerful wizard. He is a highly revered and deeply devoted druid of many years of experience, and he does cast spells and create potions and make incantations, but whether or not it actually works is highly doubtable. So it is very much a grounded historical perspective, because druids in that day and down through the centuries, there are many religions and practices that do magic, whether or not it works. It tends to be in the eye of the beholder, but it does happen. Even today, there's people who do magic. It's very grounded in that reality of its human practices, very heavily steeped in superstition. It is not the actual magic that we encounter in many of the Arthurian tales. And of course, there is the classic Arthurian trope of Guinevere's betrayal. And in this story, Guinevere is a high-ranking member of the cult of Isis, and part of her betrayal involves that cult. I won't say any more, you just have to read it, but it is there. So now let's talk about some of the pros and cons. I'll start with the pros. I think one of the strongest parts of this series are the battles. There are some absolutely amazing epic battles in this book series. Whether it's large-scale battles with many different people fighting against each other on each side, or duels. There are some really fantastic duels. Bernard Cornwell writes the duels in such a way that you feel like you are right there in the ring with the combatants, watching them fight and watching them bleed, sweat, the smell of the sweat running off their bodies. You really feel like you are there. And it's no different with the battles. At the end of book 1, there's a major epic battle against some of the Irish mercenaries. At about the midway point of Excalibur, you have the Battle of Badon Hill, which is a very well-known battle in the legends. And so it's just really amazingly written. Bernard Cornwell really has a knack for writing battle sequences. It's one of those that makes you really feel like you are part of the battle. One of my favorite duels in the book is when Derval goes to the Saxon court, and he goes there to treat with King Aiel, and he ends up battling one of Aiel's warlords in order to either win and have his life spared and have the boon that he's come to ask for, or to be killed. It's just an amazing duel. Bernard Cornwell's world building is fantastic. He's really done a lot of research into ancient Britain, the Saxons and the Picts and the Irish of this time, and different major locations in the world. Some of the visuals are very potent. There's a scene in one of the books where Arthur and some of his men are on a boat out in the crashing seas, and the storm is raging, and the waves are crashing against the ship and tearing it to pieces, and it was just so vivid. The characters are very, very well done as well. The major characters that I talked about earlier are all very well fleshed out. You get to see all of their good and bad sides, and the things that make them tick, and the things that bring them pain and anguish, and the things that make them hurt. And you see their passions and their drive, what it is they want to get out of life. It's just amazingly done. There are some cons, however. I think one of the biggest cons, and maybe it's not really a con as it is something to get used to, but it does take a while to get used to the realism of the story when you are coming from a background with the Arthurian myths. One of my favorite stories growing up were the Arthur legends written by Mary Stuart, and those are very magical, very fantastical. And then you come to this, and at first you're really going, I don't know if I like this. In fact, for the entire first book, I will say that I did not really like it that much, and I was wondering if I should even bother continuing. The first book was good. It was okay, but there was so much of it that I didn't really care about. I had a hard time pushing myself to finish the series. I'm glad I did, but just to warn you, the first book is very, very different from what you are expecting from the typical Arthur legend. And then there is another one that I do want to mention, and that is some of the wording used. The Welsh language very heavily permeates this book in terms of character names and locations. And maybe that's not a big deal if you don't care about pronunciations of things. That's totally fine. But like me, when I'm reading a book and I don't know how to pronounce a word, it really takes me out of the story. I had to go and look online to see if I could find a pronunciation guide for the series. Luckily, I did find one, and it didn't even have all the pronunciations, but it had most of the major ones. And I had to do that just to survive the first book. After a while in the second and third books, I'm like, okay, I remember how this is pronounced. But at first I was like, whoa, this is totally weird. Even Dervel, it's spelled D-E-R-F-E-L, but it's pronounced as if it were D-E-R-V-E-L. It's Dervel. And I'm like, wait, what? So I don't know Welsh, guys. So just be aware. There are Welsh names in here. They are not pronounced for you. They are not defined. Unless you're listening to the audiobook. The audiobook narrator does pronounce the names, and I'm assuming they're correct. I could be wrong. Just be aware. That may be a con for you. Let's talk about my overall thoughts. I feel like this series is a magnificent read. I did get off to a really rocky start with book one. And I think part of that is that I did not listen to the audiobook for book one. I just read the ebook. And it was very slow for me, very dry. I was like, oh my God, can we get going? I think if I had listened to the audiobook for book one, I would have enjoyed it more. So that I will say right off the bat. If you do not read a whole lot of historical fiction, don't really care for it, I personally think that you should really read the audiobooks for this series. Not that the physical books are bad. I'm sure they're great. But for me personally, I felt more immersed in the story by doing the audiobook. So that I would recommend to you. I did do the audiobook for Enemy of God and Excalibur. And oh my God, guys, it blew me away. The audiobook narrator for this series is absolutely spectacular. He really brought to life these books by Bernard Cornwell. And I'm convinced that Bernard Cornwell is an absolutely brilliant author. But I don't think I would have appreciated it as much if I had continued reading the physical books. I don't know. I might be wrong. I definitely highly recommend this to you. Just be aware of some of the cons I mentioned. Be aware that you are not getting a fantasy series here. There is hardly anything that would make it even remotely fantastical. There's a few things, but it's more mysticism than it is magical. Just be aware of that, but I highly recommend these. The prose is absolutely spectacular, especially in books 2 and 3. The prose just flows so beautifully and poignantly. I just was absolutely blown away. I would definitely reread this series with the audiobooks. I have to put that caveat in there. But this is definitely a series worth rereading, especially as much as I love Arthurian legend. I highly recommend picking up this series, and I would definitely read it again. So let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Have you read this series? What are your thoughts? Do you typically read historical fiction? Or is it something that you struggle getting into? Do you have other recommendations for me in terms of historical fantasy that I might like? I would love to hear your thoughts on it. Let me know in the comments below. Make sure you read more books. I'll talk to you soon.